The 2026 F1 car has been somewhat revealed. Might this be enough to keep Max Verstappen in Formula 1? Max Verstappen has made it clear that once he no longer finds Formula 1 to be enjoyable or fulfilling, him deeming the Las Vegas Grand Prix being something that he is very much not into, that he will turn up, do his thing, and be gone. Despite Monaco being not all that dissimilar, but he circumvents these comments by throwing history at the problem. Maybe we shouldn't be too harsh on Vegas after all. But in any case, when you've got somebody like that not really endorsing the changes that we are seeing in Formula 1, Max Verstappen being quite the old school driver, it's really not something that you can really try and up the hype in terms of your new property. That's going to make things a little bit tricky. Much like the ever-evolving changes to the 2026 regulations, which Max Verstappen is not a fan of either. Sure, there are going to be tweaks in 2025 to help reduce the amount of outwash and improve overtaking a little bit, but 2026, that's the main event, the next big evolution in F1 design, similar to what we saw in 2017. But again, Max Verstappen ain't keen on him. Basically, we're going to be getting a development war, because we've really not seen much of that lately. There's been an engine development freeze to help Red Bull powertrains catch up, but after 2026, when Red Bull's back in motion with Ford, oh, you bet we are going to see some big disparities in engines. It's going to become, according to Max, a very big component as to whether or not a team does very well. So picking your engine supplier is going to be a big deal, especially when General Motors is coming in for 2028 as an actual engine supplier, maybe bringing Andretti more likely into the fold. The battery, there are limitations on how much energy it can store and how it can deploy said energy, so really there's not going to be much competition there. But Max is also worried about the introduction of active aerodynamics, which he feels could make overtaking more challenging and result in awkward driving experiences, such as shifting down on long straights to gain speed, as well as possible loss of driver control over aerodynamic adjustments. Verstappen is very much an old school driver, with very little in terms of the accessories and all the other stuff like fan zones and whatnot. Max would rather just turn up to the track, do the racing, and go home, which in 2026 he might do. I think it's completely possible that he might drive in Formula 1 for a year in 2026, and he might just go, nope, not for me, and then just leave. He has made it very clear that he's not here for the records. He's already got the F1 title. He's done it 3 times now. Buy himself out of his Red Bull contract with 2 seasons remaining and then just go. I think Red Bull even are aware of this and are preparing for the worst in case Max doesn't like these regulations, because Red Bull have been equally concerned about the regulation changes. Christian Horner also saying that this is not going to be good for the sport and it could make things worse. And of course they would say that they are leading and they might be worried that they may not develop things, or this could be a double bluff. We do not know. There's going to be a lot of ambiguity here. But seriously, these regulations and this new car design, it has to work, because if Max Verstappen leaves, he is going to be taking a huge amount of fans with him. And if Lewis Hamilton does retire going into that season as well, you're going to be losing 2 heavy hitters, and then Alonso might retire. He may not like them either. We could see 3 of the sport's major titans quit in the space of a year, fans either trying to find a new driver or giving up on the sport entirely. It's not going to look good for any new teams coming in. But I can assure you folks, thanks to Automotor und Sport, we do have a sense for optimism. So cheer up. Automotor und Sport have collated all of the available information from their sources on the paddock and the grid, and have come up with a 3D model of what they think the car could look like in 2026, and I am impressed. It's not a stark departure from the 2022 regulations, but it's certainly very much an evolution of a theme. And of course, it's a German publication, so of course Audi's going to be the base livery for their 3D render. Since they're going into 2026, they have to try and spark German interest in Formula 1 again, so use a German team, with probably a German driver in Nico Hülkenberg. It's all German, baby! But I think the major question here, is this going to make the racing any better? Well, I think so, because these cars are definitely going to be smaller. That is one of the major hurdles that F1 is trying to get itself over. If you put the 2022 show car and the 2026 concept together, there is a bigger difference. This is quite a marked departure from recent F1 trends. Since 2009, the cars have just got nothing but bigger and heavier and bulkier. Now, we're going the other way. And if this works, we might see it happen again with the next regulations, whenever that might be. The supposed weight reduction has gone down from the original 50 kilos that was mooted, down to more like 30 kilos at best, more like 25 or 20. But hey, a lighter car is better than no change whatsoever. The most important thing for battery development and innovation, make lighter cars. Therefore, you don't need as bigger batteries. Speaking of which, the battery deployment, that's going to mean a lot, because that could actually contribute to about 475 brake horsepower of the total power output. It's going to be about 50-50 between that and the combustion engine, which means it's going to be very important for engine suppliers to really make bank on increasing the horsepower, because the battery, that's going to remain relatively static. But some of the bigger talking points here are to do with the wings and the aero. Now, you might have heard the term over the last couple of years of outwash as well as porpoising, but thankfully that's not a problem anymore. But outwash is the phenomena of the air that flows over the car being spewed out away from the car, meaning that it can just slip through the air that remains and make the car behind have a much bigger problem, because all of the air's been mushed up and is crazy whirly and swirly, and that means that their performance with their own aerodynamics doesn't work as well, sometimes by as much as a third less efficient. Teams have been using outwash to their own benefit, like Aston Martin did in 2022 with their rear wing, which made it impossible almost for any cars to overtake them. So instead of outwash, we are getting inwash, which is basically the opposite. Instead of spewing air out, it sucks it back in and keeps it within the confines of the car, which to me, I had no idea even was a thing that they could even have done, and I think it's total genius. How are they going to do it? Well, you notice those little things, the Venturi tunnels underneath the side pods, or the letter pods because they're becoming so small and small and small? That is then being, instead of pushed outwards, they are now sucking the air in, channeling it under the side pods or letter pods, and then towards the rear diffuser and the rear suspension, utilizing more of the air it's trying to cut through. Outwash no longer being a thing, and probably something not recommended, although I wouldn't be surprised if engineers do use it to some extent to try and get a little bit of a cheeky dirty air, reducing the tow, keep their cars ahead. And then when it gets to the rear wing, the air will then be spewed up above the preceding car, like the 2022 regulations were intending. The cars behind can follow closer, and therefore you might not need to rely on DRS, or DRS is even more effective. Or we can get some double overtakes on the straights. Because as we've seen since 2022, the engineers have been able to mitigate this and make the task of following the car ahead of you all the harder again. You can watch this video here as to why I think the 2022 concept has relatively failed in the space of a season. Of course, what we're seeing here from Automotor and Sport is a relatively basic concept, but the general gist is good enough for people to understand. Just instead of pushing the air out, bring it in. Bring it in like a hug. You can almost think an F1 car is hugging the air that it's cutting through. Now, I bet you're looking at these renders and are thinking, do those wheels look really odd? Well, you're not wrong, because they are smaller. We went from 13-inch rims to 18-inch rims. Now, we're going the other way again, back to 16. So we've got a little bit of a halfway house situation here. The original reason why the cars had 13-inch rims was down to the fact that that was the standard back in the day, the 80s and 90s and 2000s, but now wheels have gotten bigger and bigger, as have cars on the road, and unfortunately every single car is an SUV these days, but it was also there to limit the size of brake discs. But that has now been since mandated, so that rule's not really necessary. It was just mainly there for aesthetic. But now we're going the other way again, and I'm guessing it's probably just a means to just reduce the load on the suspension and make the guys in the pit crew maybe not have to go to the gym as often, because those wheels will be lighter, thusly reducing the overall car weight, and therefore we might see pit stops that are nearly getting to 1.5 seconds. What we saw from McLaren right now is not that far off, but Mercedes, you really need to step up, because if you get 3-second pit stops at a time when you can easily get half that, you're going to lose a lot of time, guys. That wheel brow, as I like to call that little bit of carbon fiber above it, that's going to be made a little bit bigger too, to help reduce the dirty air and make the overall airflow a little bit more efficient too. Then we get to the rear wing, and that looks relatively similar, but there are some differences here. The whole idea of active aero. I'm not quite sure what that means specifically, but it does mean that there are going to be more wing elements to help make the airflow change somewhat. We used to have multiple elements on rear wings back in the day. I remember in 2001 they reduced the amount of rear wing elements down to 4. So you had little bits of winglets in between the end plates. Now we're going towards more of that again, instead of just 1 or 2 elements. The end plate is a little bit shorter too, to once again reduce the overall length of the car. But the bigger changes here are on the front wing, and oh, that looks menacing. Oh, that looks very different. You can really tell the differences when you look from the top down. That the rear wing end plates, they're a bit squished in. There's a little bit more down on the flat area to reduce, again, the outwash effect, which is most prevalent on the front wing. And there are talks also about there being DRS elements on the front wing as well as the rear wing. So we might see the top flaps flip up as well, perhaps, on long straights. So the DRS effect might be even bigger. We might see top speeds easily exceed 360 kilometers an hour and break the current F1 speed record set by Valtteri Bottas at Mexico, thusly make the lap times reduce themselves or negate the lap time lost, which is rumored to be about a 1-second reduction right now. Because as we've seen many times, the engineers can easily negate that and then some. Wow, that looks so good. So what do I make of these changes? Well, even the ones on paper, if you just describe them on a list, they look really appealing, because the biggest complaints of Formula 1 cars these days is that they're too big, they're too long, too wide, too heavy. Just all of the stuff that goes against the original DNA of Formula 1, which had really tiny cars, they were incredibly light, and really powerful. If you ever go to a F1 museum or a motorsport museum and you see an F1 car from the 90s and 2000s, you might think, gosh, that looks small. Well, your eyes aren't deceiving you. They were a lot smaller. The F1 cars these days are a lot bulkier, they're chunkier. They do look mean, the proportions are correct, but you could just maybe shrink it down by 10% or so just to make things a little bit easier and a little bit lighter and more agile for the drivers. Max Verstappen's comments are something to take note of, especially in the power unit department, but in terms of the overall look and feel, it should in theory make drivers find F1 more appealing, because Pierre Gasly and Charles Leclerc, their main concern about Formula 1 cars is that they want to have cars that are able to follow more closely, that are more balanced, and just provide the driver with more feedback. Because I think that's the main problem with Charles Leclerc. He doesn't have a car that is smooth and versatile. It's always on the ragged edge. That's why I think he makes quite a lot of the mistakes that he's made. People are hoping that the engine sound will be a lot more appealing than it is now. I mean, it can't get any worse than 2014, right? And I think Formula E also has a bit of a menacing tone, even though it's a bit more of a shrill. It at least has some sound. But F1 needs to do all of this, whilst also retaining the DNA of what they've been able to accomplish thus far. They need to reduce their need to use fossil fuels, them going towards e-fuels and synthetic fuels in the long term, increase the need for use of battery components, use more of that battery power since battery technology has evolved and electrical output is becoming more and more common these days. It's a sport that really needs to adapt. But don't worry, we're not going to be seeing Formula 1 go all electric. Formula E has exclusivity to that front until 2039, so we are going to see some use of some kind of combustion engine. Maybe Sebastian Vettel might get involved in the fullness of time, and maybe his Race Without Trace campaign might be used to just enhance the use of e-fuels and synthetic fuels, whilst also not really changing the DNA of the overall engine, because those V10s in his show cars, they're not that much different, only they've been run to use that synthetic fuel. That could be really interesting. And Sebastian Vettel running Formula 1, wouldn't that be cool? How could he come back to Formula 1? If you watch this video next, I've got quite a few ideas about how he can make an impact on Formula 1 for the better.